This episode of the Golf Unfiltered podcast is brought to you by WorldwideGolfShops.com. Be sure to visit WorldwideGolfShops.com today to get some of the best deals on all the major brands in golf equipment and apparel. In fact, you'll probably find a lot of stuff that you'll hear from the brands that we have every week on our show. Once again, that's WorldwideGolfShops.com.
You're listening to the Golf Unfiltered podcast, your source for in-depth interviews with the biggest names, brands, and personalities in golf. Our mission? To keep you informed and help you enjoy the game even more. And now, the owner and host of the Golf Unfiltered podcast, Adam Fonseca.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Golf Unfiltered podcast. I am your host, as always, Adam from GolfUnfiltered.com. Follow us all over social media at Golf Unfiltered, and you can send us an email, golfunfiltered@gmail.com. Hello to our friends over at thehackersparadise.com, and those of you listening to this episode on the THP mobile app. And, of course, a big shout-out to our friends over at Cleveland and Srixon Golf. Playing their equipment still, folks. Love it. I feel like you guys already know that, though. And, of course, be sure to go out and check out all the great equipment they have over at Cleveland and Srixon. Today, folks, we are speaking to two guests, Mr. Nicol and Karl Morris. They are the authors of a great new putting instructional book, The Lost Art of Putting, introducing the 6 putting performance principles. You can find it on Amazon. It has been trending as #1 on Amazon for instructional books for a while. They teach us a lot today in today's conversation. I learned a lot about putting, and frankly, I think I'm a pretty decent putter. I'm sure a lot of people say that about themselves, but I would have classified putting as probably the best part of my game. And after reading through the book, after speaking with Gary and Karl, there's just so many different things that I want to try now. And these are two guys that have worked with major championship winners. They have worked with folks who have played on the Ryder Cup. They know what they're talking about. And I think you'll see, or at least hear in today's episode, what I mean by that. And again, the name of the book is The Lost Art of Putting. So sit back and relax. If you want to improve your putting, and who doesn't? Honestly, who doesn't want to improve the way that they putt? You're going to learn quite a bit, I hope, from today's conversation with Mr. Nicol and Karl Morris.
Hi, this is Bill Hobson from the Four Golfers Network podcast. And as you and I enjoy this episode of Golf Unfiltered with my friend Adam, I'm reminded of an indisputable reality. We, as golfers, are nuts. We chase a small ball around the planet, spending thousands of dollars in the effort to get that ball into a tiny hole. We then yell at the ball and curse it when it doesn't listen, even though it can't listen. It's a ball. This insanity is all part of the magic of the game, and it's what we celebrate on the Four Golfers Network podcast every Monday when a fresh episode comes your way on Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeart, all the places. So after you finish listening to Adam today, I'd love to have you check out the Four Golfers Network podcast, that's FORE, where we celebrate the game with top-name guests and an exploration of the things about golf that both drive us crazy and bring us back for more.
I stink! The ball is just sitting there and I can't hit it!
Welcome back, folks. As I mentioned at the top of the show, very, very excited to welcome two people on today's episode, Mr. Nicol and Mr. Karl Morris. They are the authors of The Lost Art of Putting, introducing the 6 putting performance principles. And it's a fantastic book that I've been working through over the last few weeks here. Had the opportunity to really try out a lot of the stuff that's presented in the book, and we're going to get into that today. But gentlemen, first of all, thanks for taking some time out on your Saturday to speak with me today.
No problem, Adam. It's great to be with you. Yeah, pleasure to be joining you.
And so today, guys, we're going to talk a lot about some of the stuff that you present in the book. It's very interactive, which we will touch on. But before we get into that part of the conversation, I'd like for you to introduce yourselves to our listeners. And Gary, let's start with you. How about you just start with how much your experience in the game of golf, where you're working out of right now, and anything you'd like our listeners to know.
Sure. I'm based in a place called Archfield Links, just outside Edinburgh in Scotland. We are literally right next door to Muirfield, which is probably a name that's familiar with most of your listeners out there. Mm-hmm. I've been involved in golf. I turned pro in 1988, which sounds like an awful long time ago. It doesn't actually feel that like it's all that long ago. I've been down at Archfield for about 7 or 8 years now, and before that I spent pretty much 16 years coaching tour pros on the European tour, traveling the world. So I've been very fortunate that I've worked with an awful lot of very, very good golfers and seen a lot of the world in the process as well. So yeah, golf's been good to me.
Sounds like it. And Karl, how about you?
Yeah, I'm not in quite as glamorous place as Gary. I'm based in the middle part of England, in Manchester, where it's famed for rain, if nothing else. But yeah, I can beat Gary. I turned professional in 1986, which now does seem a long time ago. But so the last sort of 20 years or so, I've been involved more on the performance side of coaching. Spent a lot of time on the European tour and been fortunate again, like Gary, to work with some pretty good players over the years, and fortunate to work with a few major winners as well. Probably people may remember Louis Oosthuizen winning the Open by 7 shots in St Andrews in 2010, and I just started working with him just before that, and Graham McDowell, Darren Clark, one or two others. So yeah, again, the game's been very, very kind to me.
Some big names there, and gentlemen, obviously you've seen a lot of different putters in your careers. I think that would be safe to say, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, and I always say the one thing they all have in common is they've found their own way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everyone's got that unique technique, or they've heard some new tip that they want to try. I even know the 3 guys I play with in my foursome, they all seem to change their putting styles every so often, which just boggles my mind. But I'm sure we'll get to here in a little bit.
And putters as well, no doubt.
Oh, absolutely. That to be completely fair, in my office right now, I've got a line of putters, so I am no better in that regard.
Okay.
Yeah. To that point, though, gentlemen, obviously, the book itself is about the art of putting, or in this case, the lost art of putting. And clearly there was something that prompted the both of you to want to collaborate to bring this type of book to everybody. And, Karl, maybe we start with you. What actually prompted you? Was there an event or something that you noticed that said, hey, you know what, now's the time that we need to write a book? And then, Gary, I'll go to you after Karl.
Yeah, it kind of crept up on us, really. We'd started to do some work together. I mean, me and Gary had known each other probably not as closely as we should have done for a lot of years on the European tour, but then we started to do some workshops together at Archerfield, and we focused on putting, and we just got some people coming along, and they had some great experiences, and we both said there must be a book in this somewhere. And it was kind of, I think, in the early days, it was more just clarifying our own ideas about the things that seemed to really resonate with people, and we put those ideas down. The book got published, and we never really expected the response that we've got, to be honest. I mean, it's been #1 on Amazon for a while, and the number of emails and messages that we keep getting from all over the world is really exciting. And I think we've kind of struck a chord, really, a moment in time, because I heard a phrase years ago by Chuck Hogan, who was a big influence on me, and he said that we're drowning in information but searching for knowledge. And I think that pretty much sums up our era at the moment. There's so much technical information out there. There's so much on YouTube, etc. And people can sort of disappear down a rabbit hole of trying to achieve the perfect stroke. And we sort of felt that, Gary mentioned there about seeing all different kinds of putters. My hero was Seve Ballesteros growing up. And, Seve talked about every putt that he hit. He felt like he either hooked the ball or cut the ball into the hole. And the scientists would say that didn't actually happen, but he was the kind of ultimate artistic player. So we feel as though there's so much science knocking around, which has its place. Obviously, we're not denying that. But when you get out onto the golf course, if you want to hold some put some to pressure, if you want to get the job done in the monthly medal, you're probably better off tuning more into the art of rolling the ball into the hole rather than the technical side of putting perfection.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic there. Gary, how about yourself?
Well, Carl's just stolen all my lines there, basically. I was going to say pretty much what he's just said, which is no surprise, really, because we're very much in tune in our thoughts and the way we kind of look at the game of golf, and especially putting. I think ultimately we both always looked at golf in general, and putting specifically, through the eyes or the lens of the golfer. And, as Karl said, there's an awful lot of technology out there, there's an awful lot of science out there that is designed to help, but unfortunately, when it's used incorrectly, it can just mess your head up and get your brain tied in knots. And it's, as Karl talked about, the the almost relentless and perhaps senseless pursuit of perfection. What does a perfect putting stroke look like? I mean, if you ask 10 people, they'll all give you their own opinion or version of that. So, the book is very much all about trying to find your way. We're not saying you've got to do it a specific way. We're just kind of introducing our readers to some concepts and allowing them to personalize them and make them their own, take ownership of them. And we find that to be enormously helpful.
That's one of the elements of the book itself that I enjoyed the most, that it was pretty overt, that you all said, you know what, you're going to do it the way that works for you, but here are some techniques and some mindsets that you need to get into in order to help you make that way the most successful as possible for yourself. And one of the elements early on in the book that you introduce to the reader is changing your story. And we've heard a lot about this type of technique, right? It's about not even in the golf world. It's about just positive thinking or projecting what it is that you want to see happen. What is changing your story in your mind, Gary? I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I think basically we tend to play out the story we carry around with us. So if you keep telling yourself you're not a very good putter, and you always have three putts in a round, if you've not had any three putts by the time you get to the 16th tee, excuse me, chances are your brain and body will go to work to actually create these three putts,
right?
Because they're coming because you've told yourself they're coming. So Karl introduced me to a fantastic phrase that we both use an awful lot about the thinker and the prover. What the thinker thinks, the prover proves. So, yeah, rather than we're trying to get people to snap out of the mindset of, I'm not a very good putter. Now, if you are not a very good putter, then you can't just change your story and become a great putter overnight. But you can accept that the story you're telling yourself perhaps isn't all that helpful or useful.
And Karl, the thinker and the prover, a little bit more on that particular dynamic.
Yeah, basically, inside of our brain, that the problem with these stories is they're operating at an unconscious level because you've either been given the story by somebody else or you've repeated the story to yourself so many times that you're not even aware of this kind of like soundtrack running inside of your head. And basically what's happening with that if the thinker thinks that you are a poor putter, the prover, there's a part of the brain aims to keep supporting that evidence or finding that evidence. What the thinker thinks, the prover proves. So every three putt that you have is an opportunity for the prover to confirm the existing story that you're not very good on the greens. Every bad putting round, and every time you confirm that story when you're talking with other people. There was a wonderful line. I believe that one of the great coaches, Harvey Pennick, whose two famous pupils, Tom Kite and Ben Crenshaw, both went on the PGA Tour at the same time. And apparently they had dinner before they went out on tour. And Tom Kite said to Harvey Pennick, if there was one single piece of advice you'd give us, Mr. Pennick, what would it be? And he looked at them both and he said, make sure you go to dinner with good putters. And what sounds like a kind of throwaway line, there was genius in it because Harvey Pennick instinctively knew the power of the story, that if you hang around with people who are always wanting to moan about how bad they are on the greens and misery loves company, and these stories gather so much momentum. And a lot of this work for me was influenced by a book called Redirect by a guy called Timothy Wilson. And it's not just golf that the story applies to. It's all of your life, really. And the limitations that we put on ourselves, these hallucinations of our capability. And what we're just saying to people is just begin to question that. And yeah, you can't just close your eyes and change the story overnight. But number one, you can become aware of your current story and then propose to yourself that you might just be about to go on a journey where you learn to become a better putter. You might learn some principles that make a big difference. And then if you can buy into that new story that you're learning to be great on the greens and you're learning to enjoy putting, then the thinker and prover go into a different kind of system. They're aiming to support that new story as opposed to the old story that holds you back so much.
That's very interesting. And would you say then that when students come to you for help with their putting, is it a matter of them expecting some change in their physical stroke, that you're going to give them the secret that they've been missing all along, when in fact it's more getting their mental side of the game correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we say to people, we get them to understand this, that you can spend forever trying to achieve this technical perfection, which, by the way, will be based on somebody else's opinion of what technical perfection is. That you can spend forever working on this, but unless you change your underlying story, nothing will really change. And what we firmly believe now is that the idea of trying to copy somebody else or copy a certain series of techniques is really a fool's errand. And rather than searching for this holy grail of consistency, what about if you embrace the idea that if you ran the right images through your brain, that your body could organize movement in your own unique way? And yeah, I'm sure there's certain fundamentals that we perhaps need to look at occasionally, but over and over, I'm sure Gary will back this up, over and over again, we get people to work on certain exercises where they don't think they're actually working on technique, but actually the technique transforms itself. When the mind is quiet and when their attention is in the right place, it's amazing how we start to hear different putts, we start to see different putts, we start to see better putting strokes emerge, but not as a result of trying to work on the stroke. And that's the really exciting thing.
Yeah, the really interesting aspect of that is we believe, not just through some harebrained idea, but just having witnessed and experienced it with a number of different players, is that if you give a player a task, then their brain and body will kind of organize the movement required around that task. So one of the exercises we get people to do is close their eyes, imagine they're standing over a 2 or 3 foot putt, and try to make a bad stroke. And they find it very, very difficult, because as soon as you close your eyes, you're kind of starving your body in one sense, which heightens the others.
Right.
So as soon as you start to try to make a bad stroke, it'd be an interesting exercise for you to try. When you try to make a bad stroke, your brain kind of self-corrects. If the club starts to work on too much on the inside or the outside, or it goes too far, whatever, your brain will self-correct because it knows it doesn't feel right.
That is an interesting drill, to try to make a bad stroke.
Yeah, and I often film people doing that, and I should play it back to them and say, right, okay, yeah, but where's the bad one? I say, well, that was the bad one. Wow. Because automatically, subconsciously, your brain will not allow that bad stroke to materialize. So we talk rather than about trying to, everyone's talking about trying to create a perfect putting stroke. Our premise is that if you start to pay more attention to creating putts rather than putting strokes, it's incredible what can happen.
And listeners, if you're hearing this, I think you're sensing a theme that carries on throughout the book, The Lost Art of Putting. It's really a mental-based thing, because, gentlemen, when I was reading the book, I couldn't help but wonder, or at least think that, okay, well, the putting stroke itself isn't that complicated, at least in comparison to the overall golf swing. And so it makes complete sense. Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, there's not so much technical or physical requirement to hit a 3-foot putt as there is a 300-yard drive.
Right.
So, it shouldn't be too difficult technically to learn.
One of the things I think for everybody listening to understand is that the body has an incredible ability to organize movement based around intention. We talk a lot about intention in the book. If you have the intention to lift up a cup, you'll lift up a cup to your mouth. You have an intention to feed yourself, you'll use a knife and fork. Intention to use a pen. All those different things. When you have real clear intention, what you're trying to get the ball to do relative to the hole. Again, as we said earlier on, it's amazing how movement begins to organize, because it seems when we get our attention in the right place, some really quite magical things can happen.
The body is an amazing thing. Even overcompensation or correcting naturally, and you don't even notice it going. I mean, that was something that was taught to me long ago about this game. And, gentlemen, one of the things in the book that I really, really was happy that you touched on was in regard to intention, as you just mentioned, Karl, and specifically the chapter that talks about the 2 questions. And one way that you summarized the questions was, the quality of your putting will be determined by the quality of your questions. I found that to be very interesting. And does that speak to kind of that intent, Karl, that you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we firmly believe that attention is everything, and not just in putting, not just in golf. It is in life. Your experience of life will pretty much be determined by what you decide to pay attention to. And most of the time with putting, or not most of the time, with putting, we have this rule that your attention's either on something that's useful to the task or useless. And the great thing about questions is, if I said to everybody now, you're listening to this podcast, what can you hear in the background? Immediately people will probably just momentarily drift off somewhere else, because what questions focus your attention. And that is just a massive element, really, of understanding how better to sort of work with your mind on the golf course. Because if questions focus your attention, which they do, surely the game of golf should be about asking some better questions. Now, it can seem ridiculously simple to ask just a couple of questions on the greens, but we found the two questions. Number one is it possible to hold this putt? Which, if you think about it, the answer is absolutely it is. You may have missed everything all day, but you've got this unique putt, this unique moment in time. You only stop the possibility when you shut it down yourself. And then the second question: what does this ball need to do to go in the hole? Now, again, if for anybody listening, if you just kind of repeat that to yourself, what does this ball have to do to go in the hole, and picture yourself on the golf course, the great thing about your brain, it's a question and answering machine. It will actually go to work to answer the question. And probably what you'll see is an image of the ball tracking on a certain line. But what we find very, very specifically is that you'll probably see an entry point. You'll probably see the ball going into the hole at a certain point. Now, the more rich these images become as a result of those questions, the more you're creating what we call it's a dynamic map. It's a very clear map for your body to follow. And this is where we link intention, that if that map is really clear, the body's got a real great guide to actually organize movement around.
And Gary, would you say that you've seen similar with your students that you've taught?
Yeah, absolutely. Intention, attention are the keys to good putting, to good playing, but especially on the greens. When we ask people, these two questions: is it possible the ball can go in the hole? Then until someone builds a brick wall or a bunker between your ball and the hole, then the answer is always going to be yes. And strangely enough, you can actually see their posture change, their body language changes. They can think, oh yeah, yes, it is possible. So straight away, it starts to make them feel a little bit better about themselves and the chance they've got, the opportunity they've got. And then when you ask again the second question, what does the ball need to do? Well, essentially, the ball has to have a relationship with momentum and gravity. Not enough momentum, no gravity. Too much momentum, no gravity. So, as Karl said, when you ask that question, a very kind of rich image starts to form about what the ball needs to do. So essentially, it needs to travel on a line at a specific pace. And to kind of lead on from where we are with the questions, going on to line and pace. When we ask our students, which would you say is more important, line or pace? Ordinarily, we would say, well, yeah, pace is more important. Pace is more important. They totally understand that pace is more important. But then when they stand over the ball, their attention shifts back to line. And what we found is that, well, if you look at pretty much any golf coaching, instruction, teaching, whether it's videos, magazine articles, or books, most of what is talked about is line. But essentially, the line does not or cannot exist unless you have the appropriate pace. And most people will tend to... most training aids are very much about the start line, very much about the line. Very little is talked about in pace. But really, what we've discovered is that the pace gives you options on line, whereas the line limits you to perfect pace. So you can be slightly out with your line. As long as the pace is okay, or pace is good, the ball's still got a chance of going in. It can drop in the left-hand side, the right-hand side, the front, the back of the hole. It effectively gives you a much bigger target.
And that's very true, because it's very rare that I'll even play with a beginner golfer and they have absolutely no clue on how to start their putt off. It's not like they're putting completely perpendicular to the hole. They know what they need to do. So that resonates with me about the conversation about getting the right pace down.
Yeah. I think the thing is, Adam, that I would go as far as to say for the vast majority of people listening to your show, the quickest way, if they're interested in reducing the handicap, which I'm guessing a lot of people probably would be, the quickest way would be to actually reduce the amount of three putts that they have. Now, what we've found overwhelmingly is people don't three putt so much because they're dreadful at line. It's much more about pace. What we find is people are much better at line than they think, but much worse at pace. And the more your attention is at your end of things, trying to be perfect with your start line and trying to be perfect with your alignment and all the rest of it, the more that is at the compromise very often at pace. And we find that the more your attention is at the whole end of things and the more you're tuned into pace, the more you'll actually start to get that ball within that sort of optimal distance of maybe 6 inches to a foot around the hole. And then at the very, very least, even if you don't start holing a bunch of putts, you'll actually have a load of tap-ins during the round, and you'll reduce your amount of 3-putts. And again, when you get people much more tuned into pace, it's amazing. They start to see, as Gary said, you don't have to be perfect with your line if your pace is good. Once you get outside 6 feet, if you can, for anybody listening, if you can imagine that you'd had 3 golf balls tracking towards the hole with a little bit of break at just the right pace, all of those 3 balls can actually fall into the hole. Mm-hmm. So mentally, we think that a lot of people see the line as only being as big as the line that they generally put on the golf ball. Now, that induces a lot of tension because that line is so small, it's like putting down a tightrope. However, if you visually manage to see that the line, it's like we call it the 3-ball highway. If you see the 3-ball highway into the hole, it's amazing how that frees up the stroke. And again, paradoxically, because the stroke is freer, your actual start lines get better. So you reverse engineer it, really. You actually get better at controlling your line as a result of focusing more on the pace.
What you also touch on in the book on that topic is this conversation about intent and understanding the dynamic that you have to focus mostly on pace, and that's really the paramount element of it. Yes. There's also this element of having realistic expectations, and what I love in the book is that you actually present data from professional tours and saying, hey, by the way, folks, putts outside of 8 feet, they don't make them all the time. How do expectations come into this?
Well, I think what tends to happen is when we watch golf on TV, we tend to watch the best players playing their best. You don't tend to spend 2.5 hours watching the guys pure scrambling about trying to make the cut. So, and if you watch golf highlights, you're seeing exactly that, the highlights. Mm-hmm. So we only really see on TV guys holding putts from all over the place. But these are the guys who are performing at their very best on that given day or that given week. But the reality is that most guys, even at the very top level, don't hold a number of putts we think they do. So when you look at the averages across the board, it's quite startling how few putts that the top players actually make all the time on a kind of week-to-week basis.
True. Yes,
they have their good days, but I think we're slightly misled by what we're presented on television.
Karl, would you agree that in your experience, it's just a matter of golfers coming in with unrealistic expectations?
It is, definitely. And as Gary alluded to there, I think the statistic is that even the best players in the world on the best putting surfaces in the world, once you get outside 7-8 feet, they miss more than they'll hole. Mm-hmm. So again, I think with players, just be aware of your expectations, but also things like, if you leave a putt short, just as I say, within that sort of foot short of the hole, you see a lot of golfers beating themselves up about that, and then they'll say, "Oh, get the ball past the hole," and for certain they'll do that on the next hole, about 5 foot past, and then all of a sudden they're bringing in the 3 foot, the 3-putt. One of the things to watch out for in the next time everybody plays golf, because I promise you'll see this, is in your 4-ball, you'll see a guy who'll hit a putt. It'll be on line with the hole, but the ball will go 5 feet past, and somebody in the 4-ball will say, "Well, good putt, you gave it a chance." Well, no, you didn't.
He didn't really. He didn't really.
Because there's something called the effective hole size, and the size of the hole actually reduces. It doesn't literally reduce, but it reduces because of pace. So, and it really is dramatic that if you hit the ball with only enough pace to knock it 3 foot past, the actual size of the hole now reduces by about 70%. So, this is why this emphasis that we place on pace is so different in many ways, but so liberating, because we do believe that that's it's much more of a feel-based thing. And you can just have, there's a lot of bunch of drills in the book about improving your pace, and they're so much more fun than actually just standing there in the same place with a chalk line, trying to repeat the same stroke over and over again, which there may be a more boring human activity, but I'm not sure I've found it, to be honest.
No, I've not experienced one, I don't think. Yeah, I mean, it could drive you nuts just standing trying to make the same putt from the same place using a chalk line, using, putting gates with tees and whatever. It's madness. And if you keep trying to hold the same putt from the same spot, the same distance, time after time after time, if you're training that way, it doesn't make any sense. You're never really going to experience that on the golf course, ever.
Right. Yeah, I'd imagine if I set up all the tees in a training situation like I see on television, people at my course would think I've lost my mind.
You'd probably be right.
They probably would. In many ways, you're very right there, Gary. So you also touch, and once again, listeners, we're talking to Gary Nicol and Karl Morris, authors of The Lost Art of Putting here. And gentlemen, I just have a couple more for you, and thanks again for taking some time on your Saturday. We talk a lot about equipment on our podcast, and you actually touch on equipment in the book. Karl, why are mallet putters becoming so popular?
I think that's more Gary's side of things. He's the technical expert on the equipment. I would hold my hands up and say I've got no expertise in that area whatsoever. So I'll pass that one over to Gary.
Sounds good.
No problem. Yeah, I had a couple of long conversations. Well, when we were writing the book, we thought it would make a bit of sense if we're going to write a book about putting. It might be an idea to actually have someone talk about putters and putter design. Excuse me. So, through friends of mine at Callaway and Odyssey, I contacted Sean Toulon, who's head of design for Odyssey.
Sean's been on the show.
Sorry. Oh, right. Okay, great. Really, really, really good guy and really, really helpful. And they basically put together a little section in the book on putter design. And basically, they've been the kind of at the forefront of mallet putter design technology. And essentially, if you can take the weight away from the face, you create a greater moment of inertia. So if you do hit it slightly off center, there's going to be much less face twisting in that. So the face isn't going to open or close. Plus, it actually effectively creates a greater sweet spot. Now, as we are so big on getting the pace right, if you don't hit it out the middle of the putter, your pace is going to be massively affected. So you can spend all the time you like on trying to get the right line, but unless you got the right pace, it's always going to be a struggle. And unless you can hit it out pretty much the center of the putter, your distance control or pace is going to be really hard to manage as well. So, yeah, I mean, I would implore anyone and everyone who's thinking about improving their putting to go and check out with a good custom fitter, a good pro, a good coach, to get their putter custom fitted for them, because it's so important. It can make such a massive difference. And nowadays, I guess there's almost as much technology in putter design as there is in your oversized headed drivers and your perimeter weighted irons. So it's definitely something we're worth looking at without question.
Absolutely. I had the chance to meet up with Sean and then, of course, Austin Rollinson.
Sean and Austin who wrote, exactly. They wrote the piece for the book, and it was fascinating.
Yeah, they're definitely. I think it's an understatement to say that those two guys know what they're talking about when it comes to putters. Yes. Yeah. So, not to put you guys on the spot, but this is the last one I've got for both of you. And once again, this has been extremely informative, and I'm sure the three of us can talk about this for hours, but we definitely want people to go out and buy the book. And so
we do indeed.
Not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to ask if you could provide our listeners maybe not your best putting tip each, but something that you have seen work the most for the students you've worked with over the years. What is one item that you can leave our listeners with, each of you, to help improve their putting this season?
The one I'll give would be so ridiculously simple, but it would be to change your routine before you go out to play, because most people will go onto the putting green with 3 balls before they go out to play, which has an element of insanity to it, really, when you think about it, because when you get out on the golf course, you only get one go. And the problem is putting with 3 balls, you actually get better as a result of feedback. The first one's short, the second one's long, and hey presto, you get the third one in. Whereas what I would say is go onto the green before you play with just one ball, and aim just to create a bunch of different putts from different positions, short, medium, long, and just do exactly what you would do on the golf course. Go through your process, ask the questions, and just get yourself mentally ready to putt by what you do before you play. Don't do something before you play that bears no resemblance to what happens on the golf course. And the reason why that's so important, if you think of the fundamental skill that you require to hold putts, you have to predict what a ball is going to do based on one attempt, not 2 attempts or 3 attempts. You have to predict based on one attempt. So it would be a really good idea to work on your prediction just based on one ball before you play, rather than the sort of nonsense of going out there just with 3 balls.
That's a good one. I do that, actually, and so now I'm not going to do that anymore. Thank you, Karl. This was just really for me, the tips for me. That's right. Gary, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, you can't argue with the logic that Karl's talked about there. Normally, if we ask people why they take 3 golf balls, they say, well, they come in sleeves of 3. Which, yeah, okay, maybe they do, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Take what you're allowed out of the golf course, a putter and a golf ball. For me, the biggest thing that I've seen, the biggest kind of light bulb moment I see with a lot of the players I work with is actually green reading. Because you can have the best technique in the world, you can hit the ball at the middle of the putter every single time, you can get your line and your pace pretty good. Doesn't matter how skillful you are, if you cannot read greens, the whole thing's going to be a real challenge for you. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that we talk about in the book, in the green reading section, is looking at the putt from the low side. Most people will read the green or read the putt basically from down the line. Now, we've all been on the golf course at certain times in our golfing careers. We've hit a shot that's right down the flag, and you think, it looks from a distance like the ball's almost resting against the flag. Then by the time you walk up onto the green, you discover it's like 25 feet short.
Right.
The reason for that is looking down the line alters depth of perception. So it always looks shorter than it is in reality when you look down the line. Plus, when you're kind of crouching down to look at the putt, what tends to happen is your eyes will skim over the top of the ball and make contact with the ground about 18 to 24 inches beyond the ball. So if that first 2 feet of the putt is either uphill or downhill, if we've missed out on that information, then we're going to really struggle to hit the ball the correct distance or the correct pace. And if we don't know how hard to hit it, we're never going to be able to get the line correct. So if you can figure out where the low side is, and it's generally fairly easy to see or figure out through your eyes and your feet, go to the low side and stand far enough back, kind of triangulate almost. If you stand far enough back so you've got ball and hole and peripheral vision, you start to see every single putt in widescreen, 3D, HD, and you can pick up the undulations. It'll look longer for a start. I mean, I've done this with guys who played professional golf and won major championships on the PGA Champions Tour. Mm-hmm. And one guy in particular, he'd been playing professional golf for something like 36, 37 years, and he said once he actually understood that by looking at the low side and again seeing ball and hole and peripheral vision, he said, no wonder I keep leaving putts short, because I'm seeing 10 feet of a 12-foot putt. So we would never dream of hitting a 6 or 7 iron from the fairway onto the green if we didn't know how far it was. But it's almost as soon as we cross this invisible border from fairway onto green, the distance is overridden by direction. You just wouldn't dream of hitting a shot on the golf course you didn't know how far you had. Right. But if I asked you, or if I asked anyone who's listening, Adam, when was the last time you hit a putt, then you didn't know how far it was, you'd probably say the last time you hit a putt.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah. So you've got to pay attention to the distance. If you don't know how far you've got, how hard you know how to hit it. And your brain and body will only kind of make create the putt long enough for the distance that your brain is telling your body to do it. And again, if you only see 10 feet of a 12-foot putt, guess what's going to happen? You're not going to give it much of a chance, really. So, yeah, right. Green reading is so key to linking everything all together.
Well, listeners, I don't know about you, but I know I want to go run out to the golf course now with a putter and try some of these things, at least even these two items that both Gary and Karl have offered. And you're listening to two of the best, and they've got a new book out, The Lost Art of Putting, introducing the 6 putting performance principles. You can find it on Amazon. Gary, Karl, once again, great conversation today. Thanks so much for reaching out and for speaking with us today, and I hope we can do this again in the future.
Thanks, Adam. Really, really enjoyed it.
Yes, I enjoyed it. Great to talk to you.